Dean of the College of Education here at DePaul University. For the past 12 years, the College of Education, under the leadership of Diane Horowitz, has been presenting topical forums that address the significant issues of the day. Tonight's topic will address navigating and supporting teachers and counseling in our current ever-challenging environment. Now more than ever, we must address the ever-expanding roles that we've been forced to undertake. I am proud as Dean that we've been able to present these meetings, such as those of this term, to DePaul and the Chicagoland community. I am certain that Dr. Michelle and tonight's esteemed panelists will provide to you insight and tools to help us navigate these very difficult topics. I would like to introduce to you Dr. Becky Michelle, who's an associate professor in the counseling program at DePaul University. Becky's scholarship, teaching, and service are focused on social and educational justice, social emotional learning, and career success. Among her many accomplishments, she has won the DePaul University Excellence in Teaching Award, the National Career Development Diversity Initiative Award, and the Illinois Career Development Association Advocacy Award. I am sure she will do a great job moderating this panel tonight. Becky?
Thank you so much, Dean Zients, for that warm welcome and for being here to support this forum tonight. We want to give an extra special thanks to Diane Horowitz, who, as Dean Zients mentioned, is the coordinator of our educational issues forums, who has done a fantastic job organizing the COE forum today. We also want to thank Camille, Meredith, and Danny for your administrative assistance and technical expertise today with the forum. I am deeply honored to be here today with our panelists, who have so much to teach us about the personal and professional challenges educators are facing within schools today, and how we might overcome them at the individual, school, and state levels. The past 2 years of living through the pandemic have been difficult. For educators, it's been especially so. The stressors of staffing shortages, the censorship or limiting of what they can teach and how, and the social media backlash on COVID protocols have taken quite a toll. It is not surprising that in a recent National Education Association survey, 90% of educators listed burnout and pandemic-related stress as their most serious problems. We are in the midst of a great resignation as people reevaluate their lives and their careers. Since the pandemic began in the US, the National Bureau of Labor Statistics determined that 600,000 fewer educators are working in public education. Additionally, NEA reported how 55% of the educators surveyed are thinking about leaving the profession earlier than planned. Nevertheless, this moment in our nation's history is both a crisis and an opportunity for educators, educational leaders, unions, and colleges of education. The worldwide upending of how we live and how we learn is forcing us to realize that it's now time to reimagine schools, not only as places of learning and growth for students, they must also be places of learning and growth for teachers, staff, and administrators. There's much in the media about how to improve the work lives of educators. Sadly, these opinions don't often come from educators themselves. We're fortunate tonight, though, we're hearing firsthand from experienced educators who face these challenges every day, and they know what is different about how to envision the schools of tomorrow. They've made time to share with us their wisdom and innovative solutions to some of our most pressing educational challenges. Please join me in thanking them for being here. And know that we thank you for coming to be part of this forum, designated to learn and grow in understanding. And as St. Vincent de Paul often said, what must be done. So today we will be having our panelists speak, and I'm going to introduce the panelists now. And we may have time at the end for a Q&A. And so if you have questions for any of the panelists, please feel free to put those in the YouTube chat. So Dr. Monique Rideau-Smith is a Chicago public school teacher currently on leave. She taught middle school social studies for over 10 years on the south and west sides of Chicago in the North Lawndale and Chicago-Long communities. In 2011, while working as a full-time teacher, Monique received her doctorate degree from the University of Illinois at Chicago in Educational Policy Studies and Urban Education. She transitioned from the classroom in December 2016 and currently works for the Illinois Federation of Teachers as a Union Professional Issues Director. In her current position, she continues her work as a youth, community, and union activist by advocating for policies and practices that will improve the educational opportunities and life outcomes of people of color. Dr. Radu Smith will begin the panel with a discussion of some of the causes of educator stress and dissatisfaction that have resulted in teachers leaving the profession. She will wrap up at the end by offering examples of policy solutions at the district and state level, as well as teacher advocacy to effectively address these issues. Thank you, Monique. So Kristine Argue-Mason is the Executive Director for the Partnership for Resilience, an Illinois nonprofit working to improve academic, health, and social outcomes for children by fostering trauma-responsive schools and effective family, school, health, and community partnerships. Before coming to Partnership for Resilience, Kristine served as an instructional resource and professional development director with the Illinois Education Association. Since 2016, her primary role was developing professional development to meet the IEA NEA's objectives of building awareness of the research from the ACEs study, the public health crisis of toxic stress, and the importance of mitigating and preventing its impact on our youth. Kristine has worked diligently to help implement trauma-responsive practices in schools throughout Illinois. Additionally, Kristine has over 15 years of classroom teaching experience in both the comprehensive high school and alternative high school settings. Kristine holds a Bachelor of Arts in English from Hampton University and a Master of Arts in Public Policy Administration from National Louis University. Kristine will present an overview of how educators can develop multiple strategies to ensure a collaborative and safe school environment. Kirsten Perry is a social emotional learning specialist in Chicago Public Schools. Kirsten earned her bachelor's degree in history from the University of Illinois at Chicago and her master's degree from DePaul University in school counseling. Kirsten served as a school counselor in CPS for 7 years. And in 2018, she was named the National School Counselor of the Year by the American School Counselor Association for her work at Longdale Community Academy. She was also honored by Michelle Obama as part of the Reach Higher initiative at the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C. Since then, Kirsten has been featured in numerous articles, publications, podcasts, and interviews all over the nation. Kirsten now has served in the district office of the Social Emotional Learning for Chicago Public Schools for the past 4 years, supporting school counselors and educators throughout the city. She also served as the president of the Illinois School Counselor Association and as an adjunct instructor at DePaul University's school counseling program. Thank you, Kirsten. Tanyelle Hanna is the principal of Benjamin E. Mays Elementary Academy in Chicago. Ms. Hanna has been in education for 16 years. Her experience within the district includes being a teacher, teacher leader, dean of students, resident principal, assistant principal, and now the role she's proudest of, parent. She is currently serving as principal of Benjamin E. Mays Academy. Danielle is a graduate of Hampton University and Dominican University. She is currently pursuing a doctoral degree in educational leadership at National Louis University. This past year, she was named as one of CPS Distinguished Leaders with the Game Changer Award for her exceptional work in realizing the vision in their school, closing the achievement gap, and are promoting equity and inclusion. Currently, she is serving on the first ever elected CPS Principal Advisory Council. PAC will help shape district policies, provide feedback to the CEO and CEDO on relevant district topics, and inform our future work and goals as a district. Principal Hanna serves on the committee to plan CPS's Summer Leadership Summit for all CPS's district leaders. She sat on the committee to Reimagine CPS's Student Rights and Responsibilities Manual and is also a network liaison. Kirsten and Tanyelle will be in conversation sharing with us what has worked in the Englewood community, and in particular in Ms. Hanna's school, to engage teachers and counselors in creating a supportive whole school environment. So without further ado, we'll welcome our first panelist, Dr. Radu Smith.
Good evening. Thank you so very much for that introduction. Again, my name is Dr. Monique Rideau-Smith, and I am the Director of Union Professional Issues with the Illinois Federation of Teachers. And so I'm going to start off just by talking about the state of education right now and the state of our educators. I'm going to start by giving some bad news first, unfortunately, but we're going to end with some hope because we all need that right now. So I'd like to start by first talking about in 2017, the American Federation of Teachers, which is one of the national teachers unions, they took a quality of life survey for teachers. And they found that educators and school staff almost always or often found their work stressful the majority of the time. And that was significantly higher than workers in the general population. They also found that about 60% of educators and school staff felt that they were not respected by media and by state and federal elected officials. Teachers and school staff reported being more stressed than other US workers. And the 2017 sample also showed a dramatic increase in the number of educators that reporting that they had 7 or more days in the past 30 when their mental health was not good. So it was 34% in 2015, and it was up to 58% by 2017, both being significantly higher than other US workers. And so when we think about that, we also asked in that sample, the AFT did, about what were some of the causes of the stress that teachers and educators were feeling. And some of the major forms of stress or the causes of the toxic stress that many educators were experiencing was they said that there were the testing policies, that many of them did not get into the profession to continually test their students, but they felt like testing of students had strangled the love and the joy out of teaching and learning. They felt a lack of autonomy due to those testing regimes. They also felt a lot of stress from an evaluation system that they felt was not about growth and about professional growth for them, but was more about catching them in the wrong. It was more about punishing and shaming teachers. And so, again, one of the other things that they found was that these evaluation systems, so-called assessment systems, but really testing regimes, that all of these things were really punitive in forms of punishing our most vulnerable schools and communities. And so basically, we're punishing our educators who are choosing to work with our most vulnerable. Now, I start with that because that was in 2017, which was a stressful time. But the last 2 years, as was already mentioned in the introduction, we have seen a dramatic increase in the toxic stress of educators. The COVID pandemic, the sickness, the death, the isolation, the uncertainty has been devastating to all of us, to all of our communities. But it's been especially difficult for educators when you're trying to navigate your own trauma, because educators are experiencing all of those things, but they're also trying to help young people navigate through their pain and trauma as well. Young people who are still developing cognitively, who are undergoing their own hormonal changes, who are dealing with unprecedented loss and trauma themselves amidst a world of adults who also don't know how to navigate this unprecedented time. And if we think about it, this is compounded trauma because many of our students already were experiencing trauma. So this has only compounded their trauma. This has only compounded issues of food and housing insecurity and mental health issues. And so what's been an additional cause of stress and disconcerting has really been how quickly things have changed. Again, this was kind of stated in the intro as well, is when the pandemic first began, there was an enormous amount of support for educators. You know, schools were still open, right? They weren't necessarily open for students to go into buildings, but PSRPs, our paraprofessionals, they were still at buildings, making sure that children and families were able to get food, teachers who were walking through their neighborhoods just so students could still get a glimpse of them. They were changing their hours in higher ed to make sure that students, they could accommodate students' different schedules. And so all of these things made educators heroes, you know, for about half a second. Because as folks became a little bit more stir crazy, and this lasted more than 2 weeks, more than a month, more than 2 months, and folks longed to get back to normal, that appreciation for educators quickly shifted. And soon the same educators that were heroes were now being villainized as lazy and unprofessional for wanting basic mitigations and protections. And what we have to understand is that educators are hyper aware of the problematic aspects of school buildings. They work in school buildings every day. So they knew that ventilation would be a problem. They knew that some of them were working in buildings where windows didn't open. They understood that there would be no social distancing possible with 35 students in a classroom. They understood that it would take time and practice for 6-year-olds to wear a mask correctly and to social distance. And yet all of a sudden, those practical things didn't matter anymore. And there was this politicization of school reopening that attempted to pit parents against educators. And at the same time, Black, Indigenous, and Latinx communities were being disparately impacted by the pandemic. Every negative impact was hitting Black and Brown communities hardest. The number of infections, the unemployment rates, the digital divide, housing insecurity, everything was hitting those communities harder. And what a recent study out of Georgia found is that as there was more reportage of the disparate impacts of COVID, as folks found out that COVID was disproportionately impacting Black and Brown communities, the empathy of white folks decreased, as did their support for mitigations. In the addition to the COVID pandemic, in 2020, we experienced the public lynching of George Floyd. And that, coupled with the police murder of others like Breonna Taylor, saw a global outcry for justice. And the term systemic racism was used more in 2020 than in the last 30 years combined in mainstream media. So what happened? Well, we saw that same vocal minority that has sought to politicize COVID turned their attention to schools in a different way, right? They turned their attention to having this faux outrage of critical race theory, a scholarly theory of study that's been developed by scholars of color and has been among us for over 40 years, suddenly became the focus of those who want to cement this current system of inequity. And these folks understand the power of education, the power of educators. And so they focus their vitriol on schools and school curricula. And just 1 year after all the corporate commitments to diversity, equity, and inclusion, there were 28 states that sought to ban critical race theory from being taught in classrooms, and other bills that sought to severely limit what could be taught in classrooms regarding equity and diversity and race and gender justice. And this was a strategic ploy on the part of the right wing to organize their base around hate and fear. And it's that same hate and fear and anti-Blackness that fueled the attack in Buffalo. So while educators were still trying to help navigate the pandemic and engage students despite their trauma, they were thrust into a war on whether or not to teach the truth. And while they were, again, still navigating a pandemic that was having a disparate impact on Black and Brown students, as their students were actively protesting police violence against Black people, educators were at the same time being told not to talk about systemic racism or equity or any topic that would hurt the feelings of white folks. So if you think about this context, this is why the state of education is where it is. After the disruption of COVID for the last 2 years, educators are being asked to go back to a normal when that no longer exists. And so for that reason, we're seeing unparalleled shortages of educators across the nation. And again, according to the National Education Association, 3/4 of members have said that they've had to fill in for their colleagues or take other duties due to staff shortages. 80% of members report that unfilled job openings have led to more work obligations for them and their fellow educators who remain. 90% of educators are saying that burnout is a serious problem, right? And more than half of members have said that they plan to leave education sooner than they had planned because of the pandemic. And this is very much aligned to a recent poll that the Illinois Federation of Teachers took right here in Illinois. So we're at a real crossroads, and how we respond in this moment will really determine public education for years to come. And so that's the bad news. But the good news is that this disruption of COVID has provided us an opportunity to not go back to the normalcy of inequity, right? The unprecedented amount of funding that has been allocated to states and districts provide us with a once in a lifetime opportunity. We have an opportunity to reimagine schools, teaching, and learning. COVID has forced us to do things that folks said wasn't possible. We've had to teach differently. We've had to engage students and families in a different, more authentic and culturally relevant way. We've had to assess students differently. We had to prioritize students and families' health and well-being over scope and sequence charts and unit standards. We learned that academic standards are not ordained by God, right? That they're actually man-made and can be adapted, because what children need should be driving us. That should be our compass and not the other way around. So what about these aggressive political forces that are using legislation and dark money to attempt to silence and keep people at the margins? Well, if we change our perspective a little bit, we don't look at this as them winning. We understand these attacks as acts of desperation. In this country, there's a tradition that often when there's any kind of perceived racial progress, there's a swift and often violent backlash. And so we are experiencing that right now, but that has never stopped folks from fighting. That has never stopped the resistance. And so we are not going to go back to the normalcy of inequity. More than ever before, we have the ability to do things and that we've never have had before. We have the ability to create a system, to create schools that our students deserve, sustainable community schools, smaller class sizes, more energy efficient buildings, flexible schedules, nurses and social workers in every school, mental health practitioners, real investment in restorative justice. We have an opportunity right now to do it, but we have to use our collective power and refuse to go back. And so to talk more about, again, just the effects of the toxic stress on educators and also students, we have with us Kristine Mason, who is the Executive Director of the Partnership for Resilience. And I'm going to turn it over to Kristine.
Thank you, Dr. Rideaux-Smith. Thank you so much. It is an absolute pleasure and delight to be with you all this evening, just to take a few minutes to drill down on something that really is really very important. I wanted to talk to you about how schools can develop multiple strategies to foster collaborative and safe environments, and the importance of social emotional learning principles for adults. But what I need to say is that what I want to talk about is not a cachet of lesson plans or techniques. It isn't a particular type of fairy dust or some curriculum that you can take off the shelf and have things happen. We already know that that's not how we'll get to where we need to be. I think a big component of it all is having the ability, the strength, the tools, and the support to advocate for what's needed in this space. I'm going to share my screen. I have a few slides that I wanted to share. All right. So I know that by now a number of folks have seen this image. And we often hear when it comes to self-care that adults have to put their mask on first before they can help others. I wanted to give a nod to Dr. Erlene Grice Owens, lead co-editor of the A to Z Self-Care Handbook for Social Workers and Other Helping Professionals. She maintains that a common metaphor, the one that you see before you, depicts self-care as the emergency mask used in air travel. And while this metaphor conveys that we must put on our masks or do our self-care before we can help others, she challenges that mask metaphor, and I stand in agreement with her. It gets us a little closer to where we need to be about what educators might need in this space, but we need to expand that mask metaphor. When we are talking about self-care, I would say prior to the pandemic, and this is what I noticed in the work with various school districts across the state, we recognized that we needed to start with self-care for adults. But as time passed, what came to be pretty clear is that it had been left up to the individual to provide self-care. And the individual was then suddenly vilified for an inability to be able to take care of self. And when we think about it, it's because educators were being asked to do something in a system that didn't necessarily support it. Recognize that the system should create a culture and climate where it is safe to explore and grow the skill sets for self-care. And it really is connected to social emotional skills, not just for the kiddos, but for the adults as well. So while we see this metaphor of putting your own mask on first before you can help others, Trudy Frazzle, who consults with CPS workers, wrote a thought-provoking blog post-challenging the dominant airline passenger metaphor. She suggests a scuba diver metaphor instead, maintaining that scuba divers use oxygen tanks with masks to dive deeply. She develops this metaphor beautifully. Scuba divers must be trained. They must check and maintain their equipment. They have to dive with a buddy, and they have agency and control. And she ends by asking, what fills your oxygen tank? What sustains your breath? Those questions, that metaphor, I believe could be very much connected to the social emotional skills that perhaps we assume that everybody has. But in reality, the question must be asked, when have we had an opportunity to really develop those skills, especially amidst a pandemic? I think it's important to do a little demystification of social emotional learning. Prior to the pandemic, everybody was talking about social emotional learning for students. I maintain that it is not just for kids, it's for adults as well. But I think it's important to demystify what we mean when we say adult social emotional learning. What you see on the screen before you is something that probably looks very, very familiar. It's that castle wheel for the social emotional competencies. And I want to offer this as a framework for those of you entering the profession, in the profession, contemplating exiting the profession. That when we look at social emotional learning skills, we really are looking at the me of a person. And as an adult in a space trying to create social emotional competencies for everyone, again, not just kids, we should be asking ourselves, how can we as individuals first help ourselves with our me stuff, right? Like, what can I do to help my own self with my own self-awareness? What can I do? What skills do I need to develop my self-management skills? At the end of the day, excuse me, when we better develop our social emotional learning skills, we have an opportunity to show up not only for ourselves, but for our students the best that we can every single day. So again, helping us to understand our me and being provided an opportunity to do that within the workspace is critically important. When we're talking about social emotional learning skills, we're also talking about the you and the me. In other words, what can I do as an adult in this space to develop my skills about how I am relating to another person? This is about relationship skills. When in our workspace do we have an opportunity to truly work on relationship skills? And then there's social awareness. As Dr. Rideau-Smith talked about the social unrest that we've all experienced as a nation over the course of these past few years specifically, we have a responsibility to allow and hold space to become more socially aware. The systems that we work in are obligated to allow us to be able to do that. And then finally, in terms of developing those social emotional learning skills, is really looking at how an individual, the adult, is equipped with responsible decision making. In other words, how can I, as an adult, develop my skills around how I am showing up in this space every single day to interact with my colleagues, to interface with my students, to connect with parents? What are some skills that I need to develop in order to be able to do that? Dr. Rideau-Smith talked a little bit about the state of things pre-pandemic and during the pandemic. Within the Partnership for Resilience, we had an opportunity to do a study, and Dr. Megan Kessler did some research in the state of Illinois, and she shared her findings of what we should be doing as we return back to, well, we can't say normal, but as we return back to in person and try to get back to normal. She highlighted the fact that the things that we might have been doing for tier 1 supports for students, now the things that we will be doing in terms of tier 1 supports for students is probably what we will be doing as tier 1, but this time not only for students, but for the adults as well. There was a clear indication early on that a focus needed to be taken around whole child teaching and learning and the supports required to be able to do that. This pandemic clearly has allowed us, as Dr. Rideau-Smith said, an opportunity to go beyond where we were before. So the question is, what would it look like to rebuild schools in a manner that centered the holistic needs of students and educators? That question needs to be the bedrock, according to Dr. Kessler, which I agree, the bedrock of further research and discussion. And it should guide the work of trauma responsive schools moving forward. This pandemic has been a challenge. That is quite the understatement. It's been a challenge for everyone. And we are being asked to grapple with things that we have been able to willingly ignore for a while. But as we are coming back into the classrooms and coming back into educational spaces, we are now being asked to look at things through an equity lens. And I wanted to take just a few minutes to talk about what that really means. Looking at things through an equity lens is important, and making the move to utilize an equity lens is a major complex change. And I wanted to share just a framework to think about things as we undertake something as grand as looking at something through an equity lens. First of all, what does that mean? Do we have a definition for it? Do we have a vision for what that looks like? Because if we don't have a vision for what that looks like, we are likely to be confused about how to get it done. We need to define it. We also need to determine what skills we need to look at things through an equity lens. Because if we don't have the skills, we will be anxious. And some of the pushback that I have seen in even having the conversation around equity could possibly be attached to lack of skills. Additionally, asking, why are we looking through an equity lens? Do we understand the incentive for being able to do that? Those conversations need to happen people are sitting down, having the conversation about why we should be doing this. Know your own incentive. And then additionally, do we have the resources to do it? Again, as Dr. Rideau-Smith indicated, one of the opportunities that we have right now is the unprecedented amount of funding that is being directed towards building back better, which allows us to get resources in place in order for us to have the kind of change that we need to have. And then finally, we need to have an action plan. Sometimes when we find ourselves in a situation where things seem so urgent, we get ready, we get set, and then we go, when we probably need to press pause and do some very intentional thinking about what all of this will look like. We do have an opportunity to have major impact in the lives of our students. And while it is urgent, I think it's important for us to recognize that we do have an obligation to be very careful and take our time to be intentional to make sure that we do it right. And at this point, I'd like to pass it to Kirsten Perry and Tanyelle Hannah to talk about what that looks like in their workspace.
Thank you so much, Kristine. So first, I just want to say thank you everyone for inviting me to serve on this panel. I'm happy to be with my alma mater, DePaul University, and to co-present with my amazing colleague, Principal Hannah. Do you want to say anything?
Yeah, just want to say thank you for allowing us to really share our work in this space. Really excited to share with you guys.
All right, so to get us started, I'm actually going to share a little bit about the work that Tanyelle and I are doing in Chicago Public Schools. I do want to emphasize this is a light touch on a very complex system, but I am, to help kind of describe it a little bit, I am also going to share a slide with everyone. So just give me a moment to pull up my screen. Hold on, everybody. All right, so here is something that we work with in Chicago Public Schools. It's been developed over a number of years, and it's actually currently in the process of being revised. But one thing that Chicago Public Schools did is to kind of take all these complexities when we think about school culture and climate and kind of bucket it into different streams of work. So we kind of call these our 16 culture and climate standards. And like I said, they are in the process of being updated as we speak. But you can see there's 4 major buckets. So we look at school environment and leadership. So how are we working collaboratively? How are we looking at our school buildings, the physical surroundings? Another bucket is relational trust. So how are we really building and cultivating all the different relationships that we have in the community with different stakeholders? Also, how are we looking at the physical and emotional safety, at looking through our practices, our discipline policies and practices, for example, making sure that we're really truly practicing restorative justice in our schools. And then finally, social emotional learning and instruction. And I really like to emphasize always student voice. I found in my work as a school counselor, the best key to success in schools is really, really allowing students to have that voice in schools. So this is a very complex, there's a lot of components to it. There's a lot to think about. So you can only imagine what Principal Hannah has to think about as a principal, looking at all these different components. So we do kind of like to take this, but then also look at this cycle of improvement where we're looking at data, we're looking at building capacity among stakeholders. And so with that being said, I'm not going to do most of the talking here. Principal Hannah is, but Principal Hannah, I wanted just to kind of give everybody some knowledge about you. Principal Hannah's been working over at Benjamin E. Mays Elementary in Englewood, and she has done an excellent job over her years being a principal, building a safe and supportive school environment. Her school, just so everyone knows, was one of the lowest performing schools in the Englewood neighborhood. And now it is one of the highest performing schools in the community. And I know, Principal Hannah, you've told me that you knew that to create change in your school, that you had to first start with building culture and climate. And you knew and understood that before we could even see academic growth, we needed to meet the needs of the students. I always like to think of it as the soil. We have to build that nutrient-rich soil for our students. And then in addition to that, this year, as has been stated earlier, has been particularly challenging. We knew, the educators were expressing burnout even as we were entering the school year. But despite all of these challenges, you've continued to see growth in your school culture, and you've continued to see academic achievement. So we need to learn from you, Principal Hannah. Tell us what is the work that you did, and specifically, what was that work that you did in the beginning of the year to set your school up for success? And I'm going to stop sharing this screen.
Sure. So first of all, I just want to say that even though I've been really blessed and honored to get the accolades, it really is the work of my team, right? So I did not get a whole new staff. This is work that we all do together. We're in it to win it together. So that's what I first want to say. I've had very few new hires. One of the things that I really love to do for myself, as well as my team and my scholars, is to humanize ourselves. I want folks to understand I'm a real person with real emotions. I have a real daughter at home. I got a real mama. I'm invested in making certain that we're all safe, right? That we all have a pleasant place to work, that scholars have a really safe and supportive place where they can learn and grow. So I really want to make sure that folks see people as actual people, and we get to show up as our authentic self, starting with me, right? With that, I have something called vision, voice, value. So my vision, we set the vision together. Even as the leader, if you have nobody following you, you're just really taking a walk someplace. So my team really shares in that work with me. They share in the vision and we own it together. And so when we win together. Voice. I heard Kirsten talk a lot about student voice, but I also have educator voice as well as student voice. When folks are feeling like their voices are heard, they see themselves in the work that we're doing, they see themselves in the improvement, there's more buy-in. And not only is there more buy-in, folks are more willing to assist and help, and it's encouraging. And we want to really see ourselves win and thrive. And then value. So one of the things that I do at the beginning of the school year is an educator one-on-one session. Before that one-on-one session, I sent out a Google form. In that Google form, I asked, how do you feel appreciated? Everybody feels appreciated very differently, much like the 5 love languages. And so when it's time to show appreciation, I want to do so in a genuine way that they can receive that appreciation. Another thing that we do that I really love that has become a tradition here at Mays is that we start our year off at the lake, which everybody knows Chicago skyline is amazing, but also water is so calming. And so we go there to start our vision work together. We go there to let go of anything that no longer serves us personally and professionally. I want them to understand that I see them as an actual person that just happens to educate children. And then we also welcome those new things that are going to come to us that are going to help us to have a successful year. So I think that when you combine the vision, voice, and value, it creates a breeding ground for both scholars and educators to feel successful and then to see success.
You know, we always say, students can always read adults, and if someone really cares for you. And I think that's true of all the adults in the building. So I can attest to it. Principal Hannah, her staff, her students, her families, her community, they know and they could feel that she genuinely loves them. And I think that's a big component to social emotional learning, which leads to my next question. So one thing I did want to talk about with SEL, and this is even in my experience serving in the district level, I see a lot of this, that a lot of social emotional learning is siloed, specifically with school counselors, social workers, psychologists. I've experienced that as a school counselor, that me as this individual person is going to wave a wand and by myself, solve all of the problems in the school. And I think specifically the role of a school counselor can often get confused. So I like to always emphasize that school counselors we use data-driven practices, but we work in 3 domains. Social emotional learning is one of them, but we also support college and career development and academic achievement. And often is the case too that school counselors are serving very large caseloads. The American School Counseling Association recommends a ratio of 250 students to 1 school counselor, but we often don't see that being the case in our schools. But even then, even with that 250 students is still a lot of students and a lot of need to be addressed. So I really find in my work of being a social emotional learning specialist and thinking about social emotional learning as a whole is that it's not effective to have social emotional learning siloed. I think school counselors, social workers, psychologists support the work. They have a specific lens and knowledge. They can be part of teams that help with decision-making and interventions and providing services to students, but they are not solely responsible for creating an environment for social emotional learning, which actually leads me to share one more slide, everybody, and I'm sorry to be repetitive, but I did want to share this slide too. And I know that this diagram was shared earlier, but I did want to point out that it has been updated recently. So this is the 2020 CASEL 5 core competencies, and it now includes 4 rings. And it's been adjusted to kind of meet the needs of current times. We really shouldn't be looking at social emotional learning as something that's solely the responsibility of a school, but this is something that schools do in collaboration with classrooms, with schools, with families, with community members, and that really comes down to creating authentic partnerships and aligned learning opportunities for students. So I always like to point this out, that SEL is not siloed. It is absolutely something that should be integrated school-wide. So every single person in the school building should be invested in social emotional learning. That includes custodians and lunchroom staff. Every single teacher and paraprofessional, everyone that's in that building should be supporting the social emotional needs of students. So with that being said, that's another heavy lift. And so that leads me, Principal Hannah, I know that you've, really been able to cultivate this environment in your school building that's kind of, I want to say, more of a family oriented environment. And so how have you been able to achieve that in your school building?
So social and emotional learning has always been super important for me. I've had lots of jobs in CPS, and one of them was Dean of Students. So I get really excited about the work of social and emotional learning. But when I think about my school and what I wanted for my babies, I really wanted a village model. It's really kind of modeled after how I actually grew up. And so when you think about the village model, it's taken from the proverb, it takes a village to raise a child. What does that mean from the adult side, right? So that really means that the school, as well as the community, as well as the educators and families all need to be on one accord, really to kind of wrap around our children. So I don't want it to feel like a separate entity. I don't want school to feel like a separate entity away from home, away from the community. So those folks are welcomed into our building. We have parent volunteers. We have church members that come in and volunteer. A lot of the extra things that we do are really through our community partners, because they're invested in the work that we're doing here with scholars. So that's the village model, is really how I anchor that particular work and feeling like family. It's really a community effort. With that, there is a heavy emphasis on social and emotional learning. The times are really hard right now. They're really heavy. Our babies are going through a lot, but also our educators are going through a lot. They're actual people who are showing up here every day and doing the best that they can. And I want to make sure that they are acknowledged and appreciated in that way. But I don't subscribe to an actual social and emotional curriculum per se. I don't subscribe to a curriculum that says, well, when the scholar does this, then you do that. What I really want to do is cultivate relationships. What I really want to do is create opportunities for scholars and teachers and parents to really have true, genuine connection, so that if something does arise, you really are taking care of that from a space of love, from a space of empathy, from a space of care and concern, and everybody's really on the same page with that, and knowing that that is really the main thing is the main thing, and the main thing is really our children. So we do every day have SEL in the homeroom. Our counselors also go in and provide social and emotional learning. And when we're providing this social and emotional learning, we're really helping scholars to do, and educators really, because I do it for myself as well. We're teaching folks how to be aware of our actual emotions, not teaching kids that it's not okay to have an emotion, not teaching educators it's not okay to have an emotion. But what we're doing is equipping them with a toolkit. So I don't know about anybody else, but I know for me, I was never explicitly taught what does it mean to be a good friend? What does it mean to be empathetic? What does it mean to be self-aware and advocate for myself and saying, you know what, I need a minute. And an adult actually acknowledging that it's okay for that baby to have a minute. So I'm really trying to change how I parent, but also we're parenting several children throughout the day. And so we want to share that love with them. We want to give them a toolkit that is going to last for not only their adolescence, but through adulthood. And I think that when you think about teaching and learning, I'm not just teaching kids math, science, social studies, reading. What I'm really trying to help them to do is to teach them how to be good people. And while I'm doing that, I'm also teaching myself. That's kind of why it's a community work. It's a family and we're all in it together. So I think that that heavy lift is not as heavy because we allow grace, we allow space, and then we also are everybody's still learning together.
I know that we actually had this conversation earlier this week as well, but just that relationships are so critical and relationships are at the center of the work. And even in this topic of talking about adult burnout, you know, we have to have that sense of community amongst the adults in the building and have those really strong relationships in the school building. So can you describe your vision for leadership and why you believe this relationship the relationship model starts first with administrators?
Mm-hmm. So this is probably going to sound so unorthodox, and I know that there is probably a more brilliant way to think about vision. But for me, what I literally do when I get ready to envision something is literally when I came to Mays, I closed my eyes and I took a walk through my building. I walked to the security desk. I walked to the main office. I was in classrooms. I was listening to what was happening in teachers' lounges and at lunch tables. In my mind, I went out to the play lot. And when you can see a thing, then you can then begin to make a thing happen. And so that's really how I began this vision. And then once I have a vision for what it is that I want to see, I share that vision with my team, with my leadership team. And then we take that walk together. And then we start to think about what steps do we need to take to make it to our end goal, right? So we know what the end result is. We know what the prize is. And so now we want to know, how can we take steps to do that? That's not something that I do on my own. Because again, everything that we do here is shared leadership, shared responsibility. I do something called distributed leadership here. What does that mean? That means that I am allowing other folks, other very capable people to step into roles and responsibilities and places where they thrive, not just survive. And so when I feel like people are taken out of a space of survival and they're actually thriving, they can create their own vision for whatever department that they lead. And that's how we're really able to kind of like see everything kind of come together in a really short amount of time, because no principal or assistant principal really can carry this kind of work on their back alone. So I know that this work starts with me, but I'm really modeling to them my human side and modeling to them my trust in them, to let them know, hey, this is something that I am putting on you. This is something that I believe that you are better in. I am not an expert of all things school related. What I am an expert in, though, is finding folks that are brilliant at doing what it is that they do. And that's how we've been able to get better faster. And when it comes back to that vision, although it starts with me, I modeled that space for mistakes and allowing folks to make mistakes and knowing that we can fix it, and space and grace and all those wonderful things. But when it comes to vision for us here at Mays, that's not something that Tanyelle does by herself. That's something that I start, but we finish as a community.
Yeah, it says a lot about being vulnerable. I think a lot of times people, there's such high expectations. And so a lot of times people are fearful of making mistakes or being imperfect. So creating that safe environment where it's okay to be vulnerable, it's okay to be make mistakes and show our human sides. So I appreciate that about you, Principal Hannah. And also, I just want to say this too, in my work, being an SEL specialist, I support 27 schools in Inglewood and Auburn Gresham, and the amount of pressure that administrators have been under in these past couple of years is just, it's something else. I don't know what else to say. And so, creating that environment is so important even for administrators, because they need support too, where it can go both ways. As we look forward to the remainder of this school year and even looking into next school year, I know something that we've also talked about is sustainable practices. So we know that this work can't just be done in the beginning of the school year and then stop. It's something that needs to continue to be revisited. And I know I keep bringing it back to that we're really focusing on adults in this conversation today. So, keeping coming back to this topic of adult wellness, coming back to this topic of building community amongst adults. So my last question for you is, how are you continuously prioritizing this work to ensure that these practices are sustainable even in your absence?
Sure. So, wow. I think that the first thing is that I don't do any heavy lifts. So I know that sometimes as educators, we will get a lot of stuff thrown at us at the beginning of the school year, and then we never see it again, or they expect all of it to seep into our brain. Really, when I start the beginning of the school year and we do professional learning together, it's really an introduction. And we will see it several times throughout the year. So that's how we're maintaining it. That's how we're doing a temperature check. Not only that, I welcome feedback. We do forms. Once we take a look at what any problems, concerns, anything like that arise, we do a problem solving matrix so that we can get to the root of that together. That's not something that my AP and I go into a dark room in the back and we say, well, here are the problems that we think that they are, and then this is how we solve them. What we really do is come up with the problems and the solutions as a team and as a family. So that's the first thing on how we continue to sustain it throughout the year, because there's nothing that I'm going to give at the beginning of the school year that we're not going to continue to work on several times throughout the year. And we create a cycle for that in the summertime. But also, I think that sometimes when people hear the word leader, principal, assistant principal, they don't recognize how much humility must come with that. So this work is not really for Tanyelle. What I am doing, or at least trying to do my best at, is generational work, right? And so when I think of that, when I think about the why of generational work, it really takes me out of the equation and helps me to keep the main thing in terms of what is best for scholars and their families in the long run. What do I mean by that? So I often talk to my children about choices, right? And so I use, and people who I've talked to in the past kind of know my why. And my why in urban education is because my mother didn't have she did have an opportunity to go to her neighborhood school, but her best option was not her neighborhood, right? And so she had to go across town to get what her mother felt like was the best available option for her. why is that even important for me? That is important for me because I want to create spaces in neighborhoods where the best is available exactly where they live. What does that do? That not only gives a toolkit to the babies that I serve, but it can change the trajectory of how they live their lives in the future. So I'm not only just pouring into this particular child that I see, but we're all as educators pouring into their children and their children's children. And we're really changing the game on how scholars are able to learn and be good people and operate in their communities. And so one of the ways that I keep it sustainable is always keep that little girl in mind that had to go across town. And I always think about how, you know, I am trying to impact children that I will never actually even see. And when I keep that in mind, that is how I'm able to humble myself, take myself out of the equation and help this work to live on. And, you know, also when you're equipping people with knowledge, education, that's something that nobody can take away. And so when you do that for folks, you're really giving them a gift that will live far beyond anything that you could ever tangibly give them. So that's how we sustain it over here at Mace.
Well said. Well
Thank
said,
you.
Principal Hannah. Yeah, I think that almost kind of brings us back to even our first question, you know, how to build the practice, and that it starts with our why and not losing sight of our why and our purpose in doing this work and the importance of this work. So, you know, my hat's off to this woman, you all. You could sit and learn from her all day long. She's really a game changer. So with that said, I'm now going to hand it back over to Dr. Rideau-Smith.
Ooh, thank you so much for that. That was just so enriching. Thank you so much, Ms. Perry and Principal Hannah, for that. And so before we get into some Q&A, I started, opening words with just talking about, some of the gloom, but then also some of the hope. And Dr. Cornell West says that we shouldn't conflate hope with optimism because the two aren't the same. But hope is participatory and it's an agent in the world. And so we have an unprecedented opportunity, but we have to take collective action to take advantage of it. For years, we were told that we couldn't afford, more staff and nurses in every school and smaller class sizes. But we have seen that that's not just aspirational, it is absolutely possible. But we're going to need collective action, advocacy, and activism to get it, because we are the leaders we've been waiting for. And so we can do this. And we actually have the support. We talked about a couple of different polls within our talk tonight, but what a recent poll from the American Federation of Teachers also showed when they polled parents is that the vast majority of parents are supportive of their educators. They trust teachers and they want race and issues of race and equity to be taught in schools. And so we cannot allow this vocal minority to bully us into submission. And so, again, it's going to take collective action, advocacy, and activism. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what some of that advocacy and activism can look like. So one way we can advocate is through policy. And there's a coalition right now that is actually pushing against the racist standardized testing movement that, again, has strangled the love and joy out of teaching and learning for the last 20 years. And the Illinois Federation of Teachers, in coalition with other organizations like the Chicago Teachers Union, Illinois Families for Public Schools, the Learning Disability Association, and others have pushed against the Illinois State Board of Education in establishing an interim testing system that would test students in grades 3 through 8 3 times a year. And instead, we've started a coalition. We've partnered with community partners to push for teaching, not testing. And you can find some of the resources on teachnottest.org. And what we are advocating for is not for this continued testing of students, but for actually us to transition to a real assessment system and not a testing system. We need sustained, high quality professional development for educators to be able to work with parents and students to design critical, culturally relevant assessments that are embedded in curricula, that encourages students to not just answer questions, but to ask questions. We can also advocate through legislation. So the same coalition, when we found out that the Illinois State Board of Education wanted to open the door to allowing districts to standardize kindergarten, first and second grade children, which is developmentally inappropriate during normal times, but especially while continually navigating a pandemic, we allied with legislators and passed Too Young to Test, a bill that prohibits standardized testing of kindergarten, first and second graders unless for diagnostic testing. And that bill was signed into law on this past Friday. Again, legislation we see in Maryland, right? There was a multi-billion-dollar investment that was done legislatively to transform their school system. It created new programs for schools and prioritized schools with high concentrations of students living in poverty. Because we know, because of this country's racist history, there is a direct correlation between highly segregated areas and high concentrations of poverty. And so Maryland sought to address that issue and said that they were going to create community schools for every school where the concentration of poverty was above 55%. So again, that's through legislation that some of those things have been done. As teachers unions, we have the power of collective bargaining. You know, COVID has shown the public how important it is to have unions to make sure that workers have a voice in decision-making power in their workplace. And across the country, unions have been using their collective power to protect workers and communities and to demand dignity and respect for workers. By allying with community, the Chicago Teachers Union, the Los Angeles Teachers Union, just to name two, have fought and won things like school nurses, social workers, increased wages for its most marginalized members. The Chicago Teachers Union fought and won some of the strongest safety mitigations in 2020 when the pandemic first hit. And in their 2015 and 2019 contracts, they allied with community and community-based organizations to win investment in neighborhood schools through the Sustainable Community School Initiative. And I'll end with talking about sustainable community schools because it is very much what Principal Hannah was talking about. And it's the model of education that we really need to transform education and to reimagine our public schools. There are 20 sustainable community schools in Chicago, but I would also argue that Principal Hannah has a sustainable community school there in Mays. But the sustainable community school movement was actually brought about through Black and Brown parents and students and community members struggling for educational justice in Chicago. They even starved themselves. There were 2 hunger strikes that led to the 20 Sustainable Community Schools initiative here in Chicago. And so as we saw during COVID, schools are community anchors. They are community hubs that sustain communities. And so the Sustainable Community School, as Principal Hannah talked about, is built on the premise that you need community wisdom and academic expertise to educate children. It's built on the principles of shared leadership, on the principles of self-determination, the belief that Black and Brown communities should not only have the resources, but the power to determine how decisions are made that will impact them. And so sustainable community schools are spaces where the community, not just students, but the community come to get their needs met through a myriad of services and resources. But it's not just about a service model, about come to the school and we will provide you with this service. It's a model about community, intergenerational, multiracial power, where schools provide resources and services, yes, but community, parents, students also provide their resources, experience, and expertise as well. And so given this pandemic, the sustainable community school model should be the model that we are advocating for in every community. We should have a sustainable community school within walking distance of every child in Chicago, in Illinois, in America. every school should be a sustainable community school, from pre-K to community colleges to universities. And as Maryland and Los Angeles show, it can be done. But we have to be willing to stand up to those who seek to silence and marginalize everyone that is not cisgender, white, male, Christian, right? As educators, we have to commit to teaching the truth. We have to organize with parents and students to vote out school boards that don't represent or reflect the community. In Chicago, we will, in a couple of years, have our first elected school board. We have to make sure that we put people in place that represent our communities, our students, and our values. We must find true advocates for truth and justice and vote them in. And we have to stay involved and support those who are being targeted for their courage in centering Black and Brown children. Last but not least, one key important point is that while we are seeing unprecedented funds now, we know that at some point these ESSER funds will be depleted. And we cannot go back to the system of under investing in our schools. The impacts of COVID will not last 3 years. This will have generational impacts. And so we have to refuse to go back to the underfunding and then disinvestment that did not work for our students, especially our most vulnerable Black and Brown low-income students. But no one is coming to save us, y'all. There is no savior coming. We are the leaders we've been waiting for. And so we have to do the work. So I believe we're going to have some Q&A now. And I will turn it over so that we can start that portion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rideau-Smith. That was absolutely amazing and inspiring. And I just greatly appreciate all of the work that you and all of our panelists have been doing in our schools and our communities. So to begin, we will start with a question from the audience. And this is maybe if Kirsten and Tanyelle would be able to respond about the specific relationships between your work in the schools and the issues of teacher stress and leaving the profession. So how changing climates and how engaging in advocacy, as Dr. Rideau-Smith were mentioning, how this might actually also help to reduce burnout and help people to remain in the profession.
Start off for Tanya, do you want to go first?
Sure, I don't mind. So what I think I heard you say is how we preventing burnout here.
Yeah, and how all of these issues are connected. So we talked about, what are things that we could do at the individual level? What are things that we can do within our school climates and all the work that you do within your schools? And then what we can do at the policy level as well. So just speaking about how these are all connected and really address, teacher burnout and attrition.
Yeah, so I want to first call attention to that it is not just teacher burnout. What I want to understand is that people are burned out. People are tired. The pandemic has brought out the pandemic is really the tree, but there's so many branches that have come forth as a result of the pandemic. So we're talking about financial inadequacies, medical inadequacies, things that were already, kind of not talked about as much, but now they are really in the forefront and people are exhausted by it, along with the up and down, up and down, up and down. So that's something that's just kind of really across the board. But one of the things that we try to do is try to allow some lightheartedness in the school. So I really enjoy, really having a little music in the morning sometimes, or we have lots of celebrations. We shout out one another. We want to feel good in the space that we're actually in. Also, I try to allow educators to teach in the space that is most comfortable for them. Because when you're in a teacher, and it's not always possible. But if you're teaching something that you're passionate about, it's not as heavy of a lift as if you're teaching something that is really a struggle area for you, right? We also do something called looping. So my families and my teachers really get a chance to really get to know each other as a family more than 1 year. So we're not starting over and over and over every single time, right? And then I also want to call attention that here at Mays, we use something called conscious discipline, and it really is an adult first model. And so not only are we giving a toolkit to our babies, we're really giving a toolkit to ourselves, and we're humanizing ourselves and allowing scholars to see us as real people. And sometimes, guess what? I need a minute too. While my babies might need a minute, I might need a minute. And I call that out for them. And I tell them, hey, I might be having a rough time. I might be having a rough moment. I'm gonna need to take a few minutes. Let me get myself together. We're helping both educators and scholars, as well as myself, to really understand the brain state, and then equipping them with a toolkit on what to do once we understand our brain state. So just to understand that I'm upset, that I'm sad, that I'm disappointed, that I'm angry, that is not quite enough. Because we're all entitled to our emotions. But once I know these things, then what do I do? And so I think that part of preventing some of that burnout, and it doesn't prevent everything. Let me be clear about that. I'm so grateful for my team for continuing to show up and push through in spite of, but it does take the edge off just a little bit. And one of the things that I really love about my team is that they work together, their community. Right? That we're a family. So I don't know how functional or dysfunctional we might be, but we show up for one another, and they kind of fill in, and we never really go in a whole lot of lack. And so for that, I'm appreciative, but building those relationships is super important. Giving scholars and educators a toolkit is super important. And again, going back to allowing space and grace for humanity, and seeing myself as a person, seeing my educators as people, seeing my babies as people, that also helps a lot as well.
Tanyelle, while Tanyelle was talking, I was thinking and processing what she was saying and how I could kind of chime in as well. I think, like I said, I see a lot of things happening across different schools, and I've had opportunities to speak with adults and students. And, one thing that I've heard loudly from students and adults is that there's been no time to even really process, everything that we've been through, and have time to really think about, how it's impacted our life or our work in schools, or how we work with one another. And so one thing, kind of trying to bring some things together a little bit, it's just very critically important during this time that we really are focusing on environment. Like I said earlier, we're not going to see, there's been such, like people are always talking about learning loss, and I know there's some debate about using that term, but if we're going to, get students to see academic growth, we really need to focus on the environment. It is extremely important right now, maybe even more so than ever. One things that I've seen happening across schools, amongst administrators, even within schools, is creating communities of support. We've had a lot of teachers come in from the pandemic that had only had experience teaching virtually, and then have to come in and teach in person. And just students adjusting to being back in person again, staff adjusting to being back in person again. So one thing I've seen schools do successfully is really partner educators with other educators that do things well. And even I've seen this across administrators, hey, you know how to do this well, you tell me how, give me your stuff, tell me how to do it so I could do it. And really creating those communities of support, and, really working on those systems and teaming and collaboration. But one thing that I think, is incredibly needed right now, and I think as I see the school year ending, is we really, really have to focus on relationship building. We have to focus on healing. And I think that we need to do more of that. It needs to be more ingrained part of schools and education, because, without it, we're not going to see growth. Our kids are suffering right now. Our staff are suffering right now. Our administrators are suffering right now. District people are suffering right now, families and students. We have to create spaces for healing. And so that really brings us back to this culture and climate work. And so, I can't emphasize it enough. And so, that's what I have to say about that.
Rebecca,
Thank
can
you.
I just add one more
Please,
small thing?
please.
One more small thing. I'm so
Please.
sorry.
I got you
It's like
going.
so
I got
much
you
is
going. I got you
so
going,
little
Hannah.
time. But listen, so this is, I know that there's probably some better academic terms for that. And we're all in academia, I'm sure. But one of the things that, it's just real plain and simple is that you have to create a culture of being okay with asking for help. And not turning things down and not being too prideful or too ashamed or too anything, really. Everybody knows who comes in Mays knows that I don't turn down anything but my collar. And I'll call anybody and ask anybody for anything, because if I need it, I feel like it's not a handout, but it's a hand up. And so creating that community where it's okay to say, I don't know, I don't understand, I need help, I'm beyond my capacity in this moment, can you help me? I think that kind of, again, takes that edge off the burnout, because you're not trying to do everything alone, you're existing in community.
Thank you so much for that, Principal Hannah. And I think that's what I've heard across all of your sharings today, is the importance of thinking about ourselves in community, in schools and community, and in part of the community. And what can we be doing together to heal and to grow as schools and communities? I love that. Thank you so much. So we do have a couple other questions. I'd love to get to maybe one or two. And if maybe Kristine or Monique could share a question. This was from the audience as well. Can social emotional learning truly be implemented without cultural competence and professional trauma support services? So this reminded me of the chart that you showed about the different skills that we need. So if one of you would mind answering that question.
No. So, I mean, that's the short of it. Cultural competence is absolutely crucial to social emotional learning. If we're thinking about helping students to see themselves, right? Helping students to be able to see other people and building empathy, we have to understand that in a context of where we are and where we live. Right? We live in a society that does not value all people the same. So if we're teaching social emotional learning, but we're not having real conversations, critical conversations about race, about gender, about identity, then we are actually not doing that work at all, because you just cannot have those kinds of conversations authentically without engaging in those topics. And so that's why these attacks on curricula are so very crucial and dangerous, because again, we are in spaces attempting to help young people and ourselves, unlearn what we have been taught for our entire existence in this on this continent. Right. And so again, social emotional learning has to be paired with cultural competence. It's the same with curricula. We have to be teaching a culturally relevant curricula. And a part of that is making sure that it is academically rigorous, that there is cultural competence, and that there is the building of critical socio-political consciousness. If it's not those three components, it's also not culturally relevant pedagogy or curricula. So I would say, again, the same thing for social emotional learning. Kristine, I'm gonna turn it over to you.
I'm not sure there's anything left to say. You're absolutely right. If there's that intersectionality, and if you're not having that as a part of it, it is not a complete or even a relevant conversation.
Yes, thank you so much, both of you. So Dr. Monique Rideau-Smith also shared that we are the leaders that we have been waiting for. And Principal Hannah reminded us that this all starts with our why. So to wrap up our conversation today, could each of you take a minute to share your why and your hope for the future of education? Kristine, can we start with you?
Sure. My why is that the babies that we work with, they are our most precious asset and our greatest possibility for everything that we hope to have. And if we are able to pour into them what they so desperately deserve, we'll get there. And if we are not doing the work, I'm not sure who will.
I can go next. I know Principal Hannah mentioned intergenerational work, and I like to think of it that way too, that, the children are the future. So it's our job to correct wrongs that exist in our generation to make it better for the next generation. And so that's my why to keep pushing forward, making things better for our youth.
Dr. Monique, can I yield to you?
Absolutely. I'll definitely speak to that. I think while the children are our future, I think the young people are also our right now. They are also our present. And so I really believe that we have to be working not for them, but with them, alongside them. We are doing this work together because we want a better tomorrow as well. And so I just believe in the social justice and racial justice work of our ancestors, of Ella Baker and all of those who we stand on their shoulders, who they understood that they might not see the reality of what they were working for, but they wanted to leave the world a little better than the way that they came into it. And so that is always, again, my why as well. I might not live to see the actual fulfillment of the entire vision, but I do believe that we have an opportunity right now to leave things a whole lot better than where we started from. And so that is my push, that we work together as community with intergenerationally to do the work that is absolutely necessary in this moment.
So my why is to first generation college students that came to Chicago to make a better life for their family. And those two young people are my parents, and they've been able to create, cultivate, and curate a life for myself and my brothers that is far beyond anything that their parents could have ever known. So I owe them, I owe my ancestors, I owe my community to ensure that the intergenerational work that I do is of quality and that I continue to be of service. My second why is a little girl that I call Hannah Joy. That's her whole first name, Hannah Joy. And I want to educate every child that I touch in the same way that I would want somebody to educate my own. And so when you combine all of those, all that magic, that is how I'm able to sustain myself as a leader, as a person, as a woman, as a sister, as a mother, coming into this space every day, showing up for young people and their families.
Thank you so much, Principal Hannah and Kristine and Dr. Monique and Kirsten. This has been just such an honor, and I feel like I could listen to you all and engage in conversation all night. So I just appreciate your time today. And thank you everybody for joining us for this COE Spring Forum. We wish you a wonderful evening.
Blessings. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.